Welcome everyone to the next lesson in this series, and in this video we will look at IP reservations and static IP addresses for pods in Kubernetes. Now static IPs for pods is an anti-pattern. You typically wouldn't want to do this. However, you may encounter scenarios where a legacy application has certain IP dependencies or certain specialized containers such as network virtual functions may require static IP addresses. So in this lesson, we will look at how you can reserve certain IP addresses in the IPAM block you allocate to the cluster and statically assign those IPs to certain pods in the cluster. So let's get started. So this lab can be found in folder 16 static IP. Now I've already gone ahead and deployed the lab. Once you export the kubeconfig file, you could do a kubectl get nodes, and this is a simple 2-node Kubernetes cluster. And we have our default IP pool that gets deployed as part of the Calico installation. We've gone through this before in previous lessons. And this IP pool has a CIDR range of 192.168.0.0.16. And what we are going to do next is configure an IP reservation. Now the deploy script for this cluster deploys the IP reservation. And if you look at the manifest, this manifest basically reserves 8 IP addresses. So you can go from 108 to 115. And once you create the reservation, Calico omits assigning these IPs to regular pods in the cluster. All right. So with that IP reservation configured, what we will do next is deploy a regular workload, a regular pod in the cluster. And as you can see, with a regular pod, the IP address that you get is non-deterministic, right? And we've looked at how Calico assigns IP addresses in the IPAM lesson. Now, next what we're going to do is deploy a pod with a static IP address. Now, I had already gone ahead and deployed that in my cluster. And if I do a kubectl get pods, the static pod has an IP of 192.168.100.10. And this IP is defined as an annotation in the pod definition. So if you look at the pod definition over here, we have a Calico specific annotation that mentions or specifies the IP address for this pod. Okay, so that's how you go about assigning static IP addresses to pods in the cluster. Now, if you ping that pod from another pod in the cluster, so in this case, I'm pinging the pod with the static IP from the pod with the dynamic IP. As you can see, they maintain pod-to-pod reachability. So there is no change in terms of networking or routing. And the only difference here is that we've specified which IP the pod with the static IP should receive. Now, if you try to assign that IP, the same IP to another pod in the cluster, so in this case, I went ahead and configured or deployed another pod with the same annotation, you will receive an error. And that's because Calico has gone ahead and allocated this IP to a pod in the cluster. This IP is already utilized. And as you can see, if you attempt to reallocate that IP, you're going to get this fail to create network pod sandbox error mentioning that the IP address already exists in the cluster. Okay. And if you delete the pod, and let me delete the pod with the duplicate IP as well. And once deleted, if you recreate the pod, so let's go ahead and reapply the pod manifest. And once the pod comes up, you can see that it still has the same IP address, right? So in this example, this pod has a deterministic IP. And if you want to connect to the pod directly from an external network, you can do so with this IP address, provided that you have advertised the pod CIDR range to the upstream network. Okay, relatively straightforward lab. That's it for this lesson. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.